The podcast series Ensemble Altogether is a corporate content produced by CBC Radio-Canada Media Solutions Revenue Group. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of CBC Radio-Canada Media Solutions.
Welcome to our second CBC English episode of Ensemble Altogether, a bilingual podcast series where we aim to share, discuss, and facilitate authentic conversations in the space of DEI and the media industry from multiple perspectives. Proudly brought to you by the Media Solutions team at CBC and Radio-Canada. My name is Julia Nethersole, and I will be your host for this episode recorded on the unceded Indigenous territory of Tkaronto, also known as Toronto. I identify as a hetero cisgender woman. I am an inhabitant of Treaty Land in Canada, and my parents immigrated here when they were both very young. My cultural background is half Indian and half Jamaican. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our two guests today, Justine Fung, E&I project lead for unscripted content at CBC Television, and Nick Meloney, Wolostogwe Canadian production executive at CBC Unscripted. Hi, Nick. Hi, Justine. It is such a pleasure to have both of you here today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invite, Julia. It's great to be here and for you guys to create this space for us to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been looking forward to this conversation, so thank you for having us.
I would love to know a little bit more about who you are and your story through the lens of your cultural heritage.
So I am a Hong Kong immigrant, and at a very young age moved to Canada with my family. First to Winnipeg and then to Toronto. And growing up, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, I was probably the only Chinese kid in my neighborhood, although we grew up in a very multicultural neighborhood, I would say, like a neighborhood with a lot of immigrants. And at a young age, learned to try to be Canadian. The idea of assimilation was kind of embedded in me as we lived in Winnipeg. And then in my high school years, we moved to Toronto. And it was a complete culture shock. We moved to Scarborough, which was extremely Asian. And I've got to say, I've had a bit of a cultural identity because I didn't know who I should be. So struggled with a lot of that most of my life. Like, who am I? What is it to be the authentic me, really? So really still exploring that in my adulthood, to be honest.
I thank you for sharing that. I think that is such a tender part of the experience of being an immigrant and feeling part of two worlds. And Nick, I would love to hear from you, your story through the lens of your cultural heritage.
So I'm a mixed guy. I think that there are varying degrees of indigeneity. I'm a mixed guy, meaning that my mother is a First Nations woman. She's from the nation known as the Wolostogwe, the people of the beautiful and bountiful river, as it's been translated into English. My father's side, I'm of Irish and Scottish descent. My family settled in Cape Breton Island, on Cape Breton Island. The first descendant that I know of was one of the Ellis Island immigrants, came up through New York and eventually made it to Nova Scotia. They settled in North Sydney at a place that's now known as Meloney's Creek. I grew up in North Sydney in a house that used to be an apartment building that housed my family members, my great-grandmother. I know many, many different details about my Irish and Scottish ancestors, and indicative of being a First Nations person in Canada, I know very little about my ancestors on the Wolostogwe or Maliseet side. I'm about as First Nations as I possibly could be, and I'm about as white as I possibly could be, being two different lineages all in one. Both of my mother's parents are First Nations people, and both of my dad's parents are white people. So I'm just like square in the middle, as are my two sisters. So yeah, the culture extends beyond, I think, nationhood. So that's kind of me in probably a long-winded nutshell.
I'm curious to know, for both of you, what your relationship is to your cultural identity now and how it's evolved. I can share for myself, growing up, I lived in predominantly white spaces, went to school in predominantly white spaces. And so I always automatically felt other just by being somebody that had brown skin. And so I think that my way of relating to that when I was younger was similar a little bit to what you shared, Justine, was, trying to assimilate. And I'm curious to know what that relationship has looked like for both of you.
Oh, wow. I think back what I was as a teenager, as a Chinese youth. And I will say there's certain things that I've done in the past that I've like, oh my God, why did I do that? But I would pretend not to speak Chinese to people who come up to me and speak Chinese. I think there's a lot of stories of bringing Chinese food to the lunchroom and, oh my God, I'm not bringing noodles. And I would rather hide my noodles than to eat my lunch. Those are familiar stories. And so, yeah, I wanted to be Canadian. But what is the definition of Canadian, right? Speaking perfect English, eating peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And just hiding as much of my Chineseness as possible. It's tough because you don't really understand why you do that. Or at least I didn't when I was young. But it was just this thing that you aspire to. And I think my perspective changed a lot when I moved to Hong Kong and Tokyo to work in my adulthood. I became more comfortable with who I was because I was speaking the language. I was meeting more Asian people. I was meeting a lot of Asian people who were like me, who grew up in the UK or Australia. We had a lot of stories. And it was okay to be who we are. And so now coming back to Toronto, I have kids. I have mixed kids. And it's that conversation of like, how do I teach my kids to be Chinese? But also they're British and being comfortable in being both cultures. And so that's kind of like, this is where I'm at now. It's like, I feel comfortable with me being Chinese. I'm okay with who I am. And then now teaching that to my kids.
That's such a beautiful thing that you're almost able to heal that part of you through this relationship with your kids and what you're able to cultivate with them. That's such a beautiful legacy, I think. Nick, what would you say? How has your relationship to your cultural identity evolved?
Yeah, in a very similar way. I think that Justine touched on like a really critical part to it, which is how it is that you identify as a youth and how it is that you identify as an adult. Because the conditions in which you are living in the world, they change. Your internal mind, your internal self looking out develops with experience and education and all those things. But then also the external, the outside changes too. Socially, Canada is a very different place than when even I was in high school versus where it is that we are today. 5-6 years ago, I think that we're in a very different place. So I would look at it the exact same way. When I was a kid, I would usually notice the difference between my two families. And I'm talking like really young. And I was a brat, or I was, when you're a child and your parents are carting you around to family events, those sort of things. The family events with the white side of my family were joyous and happy and beautiful, and kids played, and we had tons of food and toys and all of these things. We had property to go to. We had privacy, all of these different components. But when I was hanging out with my First Nations and Maliseet side of my family, I experienced the same things: joy, kids playing, food, all of these things, all of those amazing family components. But the conditions were a little different. We didn't have as much property. Our homes weren't as nice. The places, we went and stayed in a hotel rather than staying at different places. My parents were a little bit more responsible for maybe providing food, something along those lines. So I had these two wonderful experiences as a kid, a ton of privilege on both sides of things. But I at least noticed as a kid that there were very different economic situations between the white side of my family and the First Nations side. And it's about as deep as I got when I was a kid, thinking about indigeneity. It wasn't until I started exploring my identity as a human being that I started understanding indigeneity, I think. In high school, because I was going to high school away from where the majority of Wolastoqey or Maliseet people were in New Brunswick. I was going to high school in Sydney, Nova Scotia. There was a lot more Mi'kmaq around us. And because I was white passing, and the Mi'kmaq kids were, a lot of them were white passing too, but a bunch of them were brown. I was still alienated from them. I was protected from any of the racism or pestering or bullying that they would receive. And oftentimes I took part in making fun of Indigenous peoples. I was an adolescent. I was a little dummy. Because I knew that I was Indigenous and because my friends knew, my nickname back in high school was Tonto for a little while. And I didn't mind any of that because I thought it was funny and cute. And then I became an adult and the world changed around me. And through my work, I started focusing more heavily on what it means to be Indigenous and a lack of equality, a lack of justice, a lack of self-determination. All of those things became my passion and what I was doing for work. So it significantly changed how it is that I began to identify. I became much more proud. I spent way more time exploring the history of my own immediate family and our ancestors, my aunts and uncles, and my grandparents. I started examining my mother's past. This was all kind of at the same time when non-Indigenous North America started to wake up and understand what indigeneity means. So it certainly has evolved between youth and adult. One anecdote that I'll share is that I called my sisters and I cafeteria natives because we were able to pick and choose which parts of our culture, our lineage we identified with. And it's an interesting analogy because the cafeteria menu, the selection that I had when I was, 15, is now a lot bigger. There's a lot more nuance. There are more things that I understand. I'm able to be a lot more specific. I have a much more honest and truthful and nuanced identity as a First Nations man.
I think Justine has a quick, reflection on that too.
I just want to say, Nick said the word proud. And I think that's the word where I felt ashamed when I was younger, and now I'm proud.
That's beautiful. And I think that all three of us had a similar trajectory in that way with our lived experience and our kind of relating to our cultural identity. It's kind of that evolution from, it not being something, whether it was from outright shame or just not fully identifying it with it or not fully being connected to it, to evolving into this place of ownership and knowing that it's part of who you are and it's something that you have roots in that connects you and carries forward. I'm curious to know how your families and communities and heritage have shaped your education and personal career path up to this point.
I alluded to it a little bit in how it shaped my identity, how my work shaped my identity. My identity has shaped my work in all of the most surprising ways. I started at a time working in Indigenous journalism when things were just beginning to really take off, I believe. I mean, Indigenous journalism has existed for decades and decades and decades. There have been Indigenous reporters and investigative journalists and hosts and talent all over the place for CBC and for so many other different organizations. But I began at a time when there was at least resources, there were money shifting towards it. So I, of course, saw an opportunity, an employment opportunity for me to be able to focus on Indigenous journalism, stories that were coming from Indigenous communities directed towards an Indigenous audience. And I wanted to give a voice to the voiceless and all of those rosy rainbow journalism things. So I was already kind of working in that area or that arena, trying to develop an expertise of how to report from marginalized communities. And it completely changed my life. I came in at a time where I saw enough of the gaps within our organization that I knew fundamentally, I knew as a human being that needed to be addressed. I focused on my news. I was not focused on anything related to equity and diversity and inclusion. I bet you I rarely thought of them unless they came up in a mandatory course when I was a reporter. And over the past 7 years at CBC, it's now become probably my largest objective. I think that my identity as a mixed race person, kind of with an arm's length view to what it meant to be a First Nations person in Canada right now, because I was able to pick and choose what parts I identified by. I could be a secret Indian if I wanted to be. I could be a secret Native. I could go in there and act strictly as a reporter or as a white person and inquire about any particular line of cultural integrity or anything related to Indigenous issues, and be met with more graciousness because I look white. So all of those life experiences kind of have allowed me to build a toolkit as a stopgap, as a bridge. It's made me very diplomatic. It's made me very analytical. And it's because I still suffer some shame or guilt around how it is that I identified as a youth, not being a First Nations man. That's not how I identified. Because I've got shame or guilt, I think that I try even harder.
Thank you. You've been somebody that has been telling stories for the better part of your career, both in front of and behind the camera, as well as working on committees and projects like, the National Indigenous Strategy. I'm curious to know, if you were to sum it up, what you would say your responsibility is as a Wolastoqey Canadian in these roles.
I think my responsibility is to be honest and to show others the truth. One of the things that I've done in the EDI realm for CBC is become a facilitator for a workshop known as Reporting in Indigenous Communities. And it's given me access to hundreds of colleagues across the country, French and English, from all ethnic backgrounds, from all walks of life. And I've seen how much misconception there is about Indigenous peoples, how much just lies are believed, how little is known, how little experience has been had. And my responsibility, I think, is to be a compassionate person, a compassionate bridge for people to connect with what is the diversity of Indigenous identity. And, I think that's really what it comes down to. I'm striving for self-determination for people that have been owed self-determination for generations on these lands. And the only way that I could possibly do that is to be completely honest with people about their misconceptions or about their racism or about their support. It allows me to do a lot just to be honest and truthful with people.
Yeah, that's interesting. It actually struck me as you were speaking just how honest you are in your own experience. You know, you're not afraid to admit that you didn't always have it figured out. You haven't always been in this space. You maybe haven't even always done things perfectly or right. And that was something that I admired. And I think that honesty, that value is something that definitely shines through even already in this conversation. Jumping back to you, Justine, how has your family and community and heritage shaped your education and personal path up to this point in your career?
Well, I would say I think I went into radio and television by accident. And as a immigrant kid, my parents really wanted their kids to be accountants, doctors, or lawyers. The typical stereotype. So I went through high school doing all my math, did all my science. Those were the subjects I focused on. And to be honest, I didn't really know what I wanted to be, but it was like, okay, well, I can do science, I can do math. In my grade, OIC back then, I applied to the University of Toronto and got into their science program. And I thought that was going to be my path. But that year, my high school has a television course, which I took and absolutely loved it. And thought, maybe I can do this. But it was like I just got accepted to university, and I had a really tough decision to make. Do I change course, or do I just go to the university and do my science degree? And my dad said this to me because he's an immigrant, and he had this ideal of what his kids should be. He says, I strongly disagree with what you're doing.
Wow.
He said, I don't agree with it. I think you should go and do a science degree. I cried, and it makes me upset even today.
The weight of that expectation and desire to be what you're supposed to is a lot to hold.
But I decided I'm not going to do the science degree, and I'm going to do this.
That would have taken a lot. I love the way that you said it was by accident, or, if you don't believe in accidents, it was completely intentional that you stumbled into that television course, and it drew you in and completely altered your path and allowed you to courageously choose for you. And I'm curious to know now, as an Asian woman in this field of equity and inclusion, what do you consider your responsibility in this space?
Going into this work, this equity and inclusion work, again, it was by accident. It was just something I was curious in and had an opportunity and stepped into it 2 years ago. I think my responsibility is really just help listen to what people are saying and really try to break down those barriers and provide the support. I think, because of your own personal experience, there's things that you can see that other people don't see. And when we see those, it's our responsibility to try to do something about it because you understand. And so, in this role, I think it's just, if I see it and I understand it, I need to do something about it.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, what are some of the hurdles or the triumphs that you've encountered along the way?
It's a difficult one to answer. I think this work is difficult work. It's ever-changing work. Nick mentioned language. It's like sometimes just figuring out how to say things is difficult because everyone comes from a different perspective. Everyone has different ideas.
Yeah.
And you're trying to be inclusive in this work, right? But you can't always because people have different perspectives, right?
Yeah.
So I think the hurdle is when you try to do everything. And it's just really thinking about, it is the one step at a time, one project at a time, one person at a time, and just deal with it that way.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And something that strikes me about what both of you have shared is that when you're in this field of equity and inclusion, the lines start to blur between work and your own personal connection to the work. It is such purposeful, heart-centered work. And it's been really enlightening and I think important to hear the parts of both of you that you've shared, that you bring to this field. I think that a lot of the people that are doing the kind of work that you both do are not just showing up to get a paycheck. You know, you're so much of you is in that. And, you know, there's things like burnout, like feeling some of those frustrations and grappling with language. And yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of dynamic there.
If I might just speak to my friend Justine for a second, do a little bit of, I'm not going to get spiritual on you or anything like that, but given that it's difficult to avoid emotions, that's what we're talking about in this situation, when it is that Justine is at work right now and is facing, for the betterment of her work, her own internal thoughts, her own fears, her own insecurities from, you know, forced on her. Justine, it's funny to hear you say that you found television by accident, because I would say the exact same thing. I was in a completely different career. I was extremely unhealthy. I worked in hospitality for the better part of 10 years, and I got into that to get myself out of trouble with bad habits, doing a lot of nothing, facing a lot of substance use and other things that came from being a privileged white passing male in Canada, I think at least. And it was an accident that I found the radio television journalism program at the Nova Scotia Community College. It was a technical training course for 2 years. I could afford it, especially because I was able to go back to my band and ask for more money. I had dropped out of university and I asked them for more financial support because I actually found what it is that I think that I wanted to do. And I can't remember the moment where it is that I actually said, oh, that's an interesting looking program. I'll do that. I took pictures and I couldn't write at the time, experimenting with video, but it was by accident. Now, the Nick that's talking to you, Justine, is like, isn't everything an accident? And isn't how you react to it what is way more important? The fact that you are our trusted, legitimately trusted EDI lead, that we can go to you for these types of things, that at this point, you're kind of the person that I would prefer to have in any of the conversations we have with producers. The fact that you're this person now, I think, of course, has something to do with your identity, but it's also your perspective. It's mostly your perspective. And you talked about that too. We deal with, in our job, perspectives of so many different humans. And their perspectives are really just the sum totals of their life's experiences. So when you work in this particular realm, you are asking your partners and your colleagues to open up their emotional baggage. Everybody comes with it. And so it takes a very specific type of person, a very specific type of personality, I think, to be able to do that. You just happen to know what's right. You happen to know what's wrong. And you're at least brave enough to go through with it, to examine it or to face it.
So we've talked about our personal backgrounds, and between the three of us, we represent every letter in the term BIPOC. I wanted to segue into the concept of language and talk a little bit about this term. So the term was created as a better way to describe non-white people as a collective, the term people of color didn't acknowledge the nuanced and disproportionate discrimination and prejudice that impacts Black and Indigenous people who, continue to bear the rippling systemic aftershocks of enslavement and genocide. And when the term was created by highlighting Black and Indigenous, it essentially reinforces that fact that not all people of color have the same experience. I think regardless of that, well-intentioned start, I wonder if the term has become sort of so widely used that it's been watered down and now just sort of serves the same purpose as people of color, where it kind of lumps everyone into that same category. In both of your worlds, the same world of equity and inclusion, language is pivotal. We've touched on that earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. I'm curious to know your thoughts about the term BIPOC, or any terms or any kind of language in general that you deal with in your fields, and how it's been used in the media industry, both positively or negatively.
You're out here trying to get me canceled with this question.
Spill the tea.
So, yeah, I totally get I see BIPOC as a utility, as a tool to describe other people or people that, language has to get, it's said from a particular social location, is how one of my colleagues described it. A social location, meaning that the person who, it's not just the word that's being said, it's what's inferred. That's what language is. That's what's communicated. So to me, I don't really care whether or not you include me in BIPOC. I don't care if you include Indigenous people. Some people are saying BIPOC now, whereas I'm just in the past couple of months, I've heard that Indigenous should now be set aside from, so it's Indigenous and BIPOC people. And as an Indigenous person, I'm like, so what about my cousins who are Black? What about my cousins who are Chinese? All of those things come into it. To me, it's a tool. If you're describing Black Indigenous people of color, you're talking about the majority of the planet.
Yep.
Right? So it's not useful to me. It can just drop in a sentence to refer, like, really when people are saying BIPOC, I think they're talking about equity stuff, or they're speaking in generalizations anyway. So it's not really that useful. I think that in the Indigenous world, at least the First Nations world, that I'm a part of, we try to be specific as hell. The course that I give with CBC, Reporting Indigenous Communities, Duncan McHugh's thing, there's a specific section about addressing terminology, questions around terminology, how to describe a Native, Aboriginal, First Nation, Indigenous, Inuit, Métis person. Which of those do you use? Can you say Native? Can you say Aboriginal? When do you say Indigenous? And the rule of thumb that we use is to be as specific as possible. If someone's Cree, you can call them Cree. If you don't know, then ask. But being more specific, this should be the foundational rule, is to be as specific as possible. So I don't really care about BIPOC as a term. And I think that if there's a debate over whether or not you're using it in the correct way, or if you should use it at all, the effort that you're putting into that debate is misspent. And you should be talking about more important things.
Thank you. That's a hot take. Thank you.
That's a hot take, yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that, Justine?
BIPOC is a term I personally don't use anymore, because I think I was using it as a term to lump everyone in, and we know everyone has different experiences, and the conversation is different depending on who you're talking to. So I do feel it is diluted in terms of the meaning. So I try not to use it anymore.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting too, like corporations or projects or whatever could have BIPOC targets, but the percentages of or breakdown of each individual letter, and also just the generalization of POC, like person of color, like that's meaning nothing at all, really.
What does that mean, really?
That's all of us. So,
Which color?
Yeah. Fair question. I think that, in this unscripted world that you're both in, bringing stories to light, sometimes there's this mandate to have more BIPOC, said in quotations, representation, but, how do you choose who represents from within that? And I think both of you kind of have already answered that question by saying it's like, get as specific as possible and let's look at the actual humans that are being considered here, instead of just this concept of an umbrella monolith BIPOC community that is obviously so nuanced and varied.
I think it's very important to have conversations and not think about what is the policy and what is the mandate and the commitment, right? Because when you look at, if you're just thinking about, I need to reach this goal, and that's all you're thinking about, then you're missing out on the conversation, right? And
the nuance.
So I think the policies are good because it gets us to a place that we want to be, but I think it's really important that we have those conversations and really think about why we have those policies and what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much more focus on why as opposed to what, I feel like, from people that are effective in this type of job.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both. Kind of an offshoot of that, I wanted to kind of loop us back to this conversation about this element of kind of hierarchy or differences in the multiple communities that exist within every smaller community within BIPOC. Like, for example, the colorism that exists within the Black community, which, we know is just a colonial remnant. And on the flip side of it, there's nuance to how connected people feel to their roots and to their culture based on things like whether they speak the language, or maybe whether they grew up on or off res, or how much of the culture has been preserved. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier. I'm just wondering what you would offer to someone who is maybe struggling to feel validated in their racialized identity.
I'm going to say that I think everyone's identity, everyone's experience is their own, right? And I think, I spent my life comparing.
Yeah.
Right?
Not enough.
So I think what I've learned is, what does it mean to be Chinese, right? Do you have to speak the language? Do you have to fully understand the culture? And if you didn't grow up in, Hong Kong or China, does that make you less Chinese, right? So I think everyone has a right to be what they want to be. I don't think someone can say, well, you're not Chinese enough, which is what I grew up with. There's a term that people use for Western Chinese, and it was like banana or joksing. And that's like language. We talk about language. Language does matter. When you need to think about what the kind of language you say to people. And then, I'm sorry, just going back to your question, I think it's up to the individual. You can't, don't let other people kind of impose what they believe you should be.
We have apple. You got banana, we have apple.
And Oreo over here.
And Oreo. Yeah, exactly. It's all food. Interesting.
Oreos are a little bit on the less fruit side of things, but that's all right.
For those that don't know, do we have to explain it? That it'd be like black on the outside, white in the middle, or red on the outside, white in the middle, or yellow on the outside, white in the middle?
Yeah.
It's my advice. So I've been called an apple by an Indigenous family member just one time. I took it as kind of like a compliment in a weird, my own interesting identity issues. I figured that they were looking past the fact that I'm not red on the outside. And I saw that as a bit of a compliment because I've been so sensitive to not being visually prejudiced against, because I look more white than I look whatever Indigenous peoples look like. I saw that as kind of a compliment. And the most Indigenous people that I know are people that have very, very nuanced opinions about what makes you Indigenous. The idea of placing a label or putting yourself, colorism, different shades of indigeneity or different shades of Blackness, those are Western ideas. Those are colonial ideas.
Yeah.
People were judged, people were labeled based on what they did, who they were connected to. So much more kind of rootsy, granular, and way more nuanced ways than just a color or a particular community that you identify from. So it's a very colonial thing. When I got called an apple by one of my family members, I immediately retorted with, well, that's really colonial of you, isn't it?
I think that's a fair retort.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, both of you. What really strikes me in both of your responses is just the humanness in holding space for being both and in everything. Like, I think life is not, especially even with our feelings towards this, like life is not about just kind of being one thing. I think there's so much room for holding space for those intersections. And I think that's actually a good connection to our next question. We know we are not a monolith. Each person holds different multitudes and intersectionalities, and equity and inclusion work goes beyond racial identity. In your respective work, how do you consider and account for intersectionality? What does that look like in practice?
I can talk about in terms of, when we talk about as part of the unscripted department, we have the inclusion plan and what does that mean? And about, it's not about the numbers, because you can have really good numbers. And then when you look at the intersections, what do they look like? Right? And what does that mean? It's like, I'm going to use my background as an example. You're going to tell a Chinese story. What does a Chinese story mean? Are you talking about a Cantonese family? Are you talking about a Mandarin family? And then you talk about, well, what is the male perspective? What is the female perspective? What is the LGBTQ perspective from a Chinese point of view? Like, there's so many layers.
Yeah. And
what about the disability, right? So
economic status.
Exactly. There's just so many layers, and so I think those are all very important, because when you talk about being inclusive, it's not the one group, or that's not the majority that you see. It's everyone that's part of this community. They all have, they should all have space to speak, and we should seek out these stories too, because they're all important stories.
Yeah.
The nature of, I completely agree with you, Justine, and I think that the further what you say, when we talk about stories and lens and representation and stories, like we work in the story realm, right? And we can always consider that if there's intersectionality, we examine whether or not it's going to enhance the story somehow too. It's another big component of it. If somebody's bringing lived experience from one particular facet of their life into a particular subject matter from a different facet of their life's experience, then it could reasonably enhance the story. It could make for something more compelling or more educational or bombastic, what have you, more funny. We look at it like that. Obviously, we have an obligation to ensure that we're part of a very large system that is exclusionary to so many different people. So we have an obligation as compassionate human beings to relieve a little bit of that tension and fill some of those gaps, set up these equitable pathways for people. And that's what the policies we're talking about. But if I can just say too, the nature of intersectionality suggests kind of linear representations of a person's identity. So if they happen to be Black and disabled, you're still just saying that this person is just Black and just disabled. Like, I feel that enough of us, at least at the CBC, definitely people that whose words that I've read and listened to in other places when we talk about human rights and EDI, those people aren't looking at those individual intersections. They're way zoomed out. They're not seeing those individual things. They see many hundreds of intersections from all of these different places. And that's a really important thing. I think the other thing that I really try to bring to my work is an examination of time, where it is in the timeline that I am right now. At this particular time in the media, saying words like BIPOC or intersectionality and all of those things, it's relevant and it means something to people. In 10 years, it could mean something completely different.
Yeah.
And to recognize where you are is to think about, what are we talking about? It's the why that Justine mentioned. It's like, why are we using these particular terms? Or what are we trying to get at, to do right by? Who are we talking about and why are we talking about them? Those are the things. There's been, to think about time in such a weird spiritual way too, all of the sum total experiences that I've had somehow has led me to think about intersectionality like this. Like, that is something that could be valuable to somebody else. Those are the types of conversations you have to have when you're talking about this stuff. And I feel like we don't have them often enough. We're not zoomed out enough to get over one policy or one word or one term.
I think the thing that kind of summarizes that for me is just this idea of just coming back to the humans, the actual people, and then taking it from there. I know it sounds that's so simple almost, but it's
I think that's how it's supposed to be, isn't it?
I think so, right? Nick, I'm curious to know, how do you see the future of the industry from an Indigenous lens? So what is not being done that can be improved across the industry in relation to, Indigenous media? What does that look like for you? And you could talk here about the Indigenous strategy work that you're doing as well.
Yep, it's a great way to look at it. The future for the industry is bright, but I don't say that to be like an optimist or to be airy-fairy about things. I think that brightness comes along with darkness, comes along with whatever's in the middle of bright and dark.
Both end.
But yeah, exactly. The Indigenous strategy, the way that we have been developing it, is the point of the Indigenous strategy. You could have an entire podcast episode or maybe a whole series just on the Indigenous strategy, I believe, because it's such a complicated, fascinated, risky, scary thing that we're doing. But ultimately, my role in it, I've seen my objective in writing and collaborating with all of my colleagues, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, is just to bring some emotion into policy and strategy and all of the clunky, sharp things that come with our corporate nature, to outweigh them with fluffy, round, more human, kind of goopy, sticky, oily things that
I'm loving these
are.
Adjectives, I have to say.
It's about philosophy and it's about emotion and it's meaningful if it is that it's giving you anxiety or if it's making you feel pride or outrage. If you are having emotion, it means that it's like if you're having an episode during work around what should be, human rights, like just a small thing like human rights, then you're doing it right, and it's just to bring more emotion into it. There's a particular idea or quote or method that I've been encountering regularly in the work, and it's that the focus should not be on the destination, but the journey. The journey is why we're doing the strategy, not to reconcile or, to finally achieve reconciliation with Indigenous peoples at CBC. It's just about the journey of going through it. And that's how we've been developing the strategy, is actually by implementing it. Crying at work, telling personal stories and histories, like that's the good stuff. That's the human stuff.
That's what connects us.
Mm-hmm.
I think that both of you, this is legacy work in the sense that, like you said, it's about the journey, not the destination. You are working towards something that you may not see the fruits of in your lifetime. And I just wanted to commend both of you for doing that work, because I don't think that everyone could. And I think that there's a lot to be said for how much that effort counts towards.
You know, I just want to say, like, I actually feel lucky to be doing this work, right?
Me too.
It is a privilege to be able to do this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm the lucky one.
I feel the exact same way. I do. And it's because of the people that I've encountered, people like yourselves. Like, I appreciate the gratitude, and I reflect it right back at you, because this is it. This is the journey.
Yeah. Justine, I would love for people to hear some examples of the initiatives that you've been working on. If you want to share a bit about the projects that you've been on in your role as EDI lead for unscripted content, maybe some that you've been particularly passionate or excited about.
Yeah, so I can talk about two recent initiatives. One is called Access CBC, and it's an initiative for creators with a disability. We got some funding, and what we did within Unscripted was we created a development and mentorship program where we selected 10 filmmakers who self-identify as disabled, and we provided mentorship on their short doc ideas. And the intent was to really kind of give them opportunities within CBC, build connections with our production executives, just to kind of, the message of, we want to hear your stories. The other initiative was with the nature of things. The science and nature community is very niche, not very diverse. And that's, it's a gap that we've seen for many years. And we've been trying to really bring more diverse voices from behind the scenes into that particular strand. And we organized a workshop in Vancouver for 20 equity-seeking producers who were interested in this field. And again, it was just really to provide access to our production executives, break down the barriers that, hey, the nature of things do want to hear from you. Come to speak to us. And it's just, again, building connections.
Thank you. I think it's so interesting to get to hear about what these initiatives and programs actually kind of are. We've talked a lot about the depth and the philosophy and the root of them. So it's great to kind of end off from both of you hearing about what your days kind of look like in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. The Indigenous strategy, I think, really stands to change everything about CBC. At least that's how we've been approaching it. The idea of examining how to better serve Indigenous peoples and their right to self-determination is a pretty expansive idea, because self-determination requires control, consultation, ownership, participation, collaboration, all of these things. And if you look at the entirety of the corporation, we're talking about business partnerships. So where we get our microphones, where we get our toilet paper, who it is that we are working with to provide support for our technicians, all of our journalists, every particular layer of the corporation stands to be affected by the Indigenous strategy if it is going to be implemented in a good way, in the proper way, in the right way, the way that Indigenous communities have told us it should be implemented. So there are really big changes like recruitment and retention. We have a program right now called Indigenous Pathways, in which we are, in an equitable way, in a way that is led by Indigenous communities, going out to Indigenous communities, finding people who are interested in developing a skill set in the media world and bringing them in, finding ways to ensure that they have equitable access to housing when they go to work or train at CBC, ensuring that they have the right kind of culturally reflective support systems in place, having opportunities to get work in multiple different areas. And as well, if we're bringing in new people, we have to affect the workplace culture. We have to ensure that, as reasonable as much as possible, they're not exposed to racism, whether systemic or overt, or ignorance around things. So that means more cultural competency, and then also keeping them in the building, ensuring that they're here for a long time. That conversation can just go and go and go. Everything is so interconnected that reasonably it could completely revolutionize CBC Radio-Canada.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I have a last question here for both of you. If you wanted to leave us with any words of inspiration or quotes or any thoughts or books or anything that has kind of shaped your perspective or really landed with you in a strong way, I'll actually share just, this isn't kind of like a personal quote that I always turn to or run with, but I think this conversation, the quote that kind of comes to mind for me is from Eckhart Tolle, where he says, "Only the truth of who you are, if realized, will set you free." And I think that that's really connected a lot of what we've shared and discussed. So I'll leave that. Do you have anything, Justine?
I just want to say I love that quote. I think it just embodies like what we've all been trying to say is like, just be authentic, and that everyone understands that being authentic is important, and being authentic doesn't just mean one thing. I don't have a quote, but it's just the word authentic.
Yeah. Thank you. What about you, Nick?
I immediately go to the words of Richard Wagamese, whose books, Embers, Starlight, and Medicine Walk all mean a great deal to me. He wrote something once, I think there's a video on YouTube of it, about him talking about being dog-wise, learning about successful living from his dog. He says, I'm 54 years old, and I've recently discovered that all I needed to know about successful living, I can learn from my dog. And then he goes on to say that she's wise and that she's sage. She eats regularly when she's hungry. She takes a good nap every afternoon, drinks lots of water, stretches before doing anything, and is never afraid to express love or ask for what she needs. And I think that that is exactly in the realm of being mindful and present and focusing on the journey, not the destination.
I love that. I think that's the perfect way for us to end and leave that with our listeners. Thank you both. I'm so grateful to have had this moment with both of you. It was an honor to get to hold this conversation. Thank you.
Jiwa Liwan, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure for me.
Thank you for creating the space.